Yu-Gi-Oh! Has had its fair share of powerful and iconic spell cards that still stand the test of time. Cards like Raigeki and Harpy's Feather Duster are still being used in current modern-day Yu-Gi-Oh! But for every single time there's a powerful spell card that's used in modern Yu-Gi-Oh!, there are some really powerful spell cards that have been thrown to the wayside. This is a video talking about some of the most powerful spell cards from their time that players just don't play anymore. Let's go ahead and jump on in. Spell cards are some of the most dangerous cards in Yu-Gi-Oh! They accentuate a balance between monsters that are built to be able to win the game and trap cards being able to stop your opponent's monsters. Oftentimes, spell cards enhance your monsters or the game state that they're in. But unfortunately, as Yu-Gi-Oh! Has evolved, certain spell cards have been left to the wayside. So in building this video, I thought of a criteria that would talk about some really powerful, underserved spell cards that still could be dangerous in the right situation. My criteria consist of powerful generic spell cards that can be used in just about every single Yu-Gi-Oh! Deck. These cards have to have been defining in some way, shape, or form, and their usage has to have dramatically decreased over time. And of course, big dog, if you love these top 10 lists, this is actually something that I do on the regular. For the people that are new, hi, I'm TheCaliEffect. We make all different types of Yu-Gi-Oh! Content, and if you want to know about some other crazy top 10 cards, I just so happened to made a top 10 video talking about old school Yu-Gi-Oh! Cards that will be played in 2025. I also have an abundance of other top 10 lists, so be sure to check those out. In the beginning of this video, I mentioned two powerful spell cards that stood the test of time. Harpy's Feather Duster and Raigeki are over 20-year-old Yu-Gi-Oh! Cards, and while they have significantly declined in play, a lot of players still consider Harpy's Feather Duster as a solid Yu-Gi-Oh! Card, and most players still fear Raigeki. Technically, those two cards could be honorable mentions because their play has significantly declined, especially considering that they were a must-play in every single Yu-Gi-Oh! Deck when they were available in the past, but I'm gonna give them a pass. And it's mainly because these cards were a part of a trinity. When Yu-Gi-Oh! First came out, spell cards fit a balance. You used them to get rid of your opponent's monsters. You used them to get rid of your opponent's trap cards to get rid of your monsters, but you also used them to bring back your monsters, and that's where we talk about our first card on this list. Monster Reborn was often considered one of the most powerful cards in the history of Yu-Gi-Oh! And it's also iconic because in the original Yu-Gi-Oh! Series, just about every single character used this card. Bringing back one of your most clutch monsters from the graveyard to do your bidding one more time, or even taking your opponent's monster and using it against them was a huge rave. And make no mistake, Monster Reborn could still be considered one of the best spell cards in the game because there are plenty of situations where you could still bring back a powerful monster to help you in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! But the card just simply doesn't get played. Unfortunately, because how Yu-Gi-Oh! Is modernized, there are multiple ways to be able to bring back or use your monsters in the graveyard. While Monster Reborn could still be considered a really good Yu-Gi-Oh! Card, it isn't played because a lot of strategies either have ways to bring them back by themselves or would actually prefer those cards into the graveyard. This essentially has made Monster Reborn our very first dangerous spell card that no one plays anymore. Monster Reborn is the shining example of a powerful spell card that is now considered an afterthought. And if you dive deeper into that realm, there's actually a ton of powerful spell cards that were once banned that are no longer being used in the capacity that they once were. Take, for example, Change of Heart. Now, Change of Heart has had a very interesting arc in Yu-Gi-Oh! It was regarded as one of the most powerful spell cards in the game and has spent a significant time on Yu-Gi-Oh!'s infamous ban list. In fact, Change of Heart has been banned for most of the entirety of Yu-Gi-Oh!, almost 20 years. You would think that a card that has been banned for that long coming off of the ban list would be a crazy powerful Yu-Gi-Oh! Card. Well, as of this year, it's been 3 years of Change of Heart off of the ban list, almost the same amount of time that it was previously released and then eventually banned, and the card has had very disappointing results. Change of Heart is easily another one of those brain-scratching Yu-Gi-Oh! Cards, but it's actually explainable. Being able to take your opponent's monster in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Is only really good if you can make use of it. With so many diverse strategies and mechanics, Change of Heart isn't always the best card in the world. It's also worth considering that your opponent would have to have a monster that you would want to for Change of Heart to be effective. And the same thing could be said for both Snatch Steal as well as Brain Control. Both of these cards have spent their fair share of time on the ban list and currently are off and are doing worse than Change of Heart. Brain Control has received an errata, which is basically a text change to only being able to take control of monsters that can be normal summoned, and Snatch Steal is, in theory, a worse Change of Heart, and players aren't playing Change of Heart. And for our sake, I'm going to group Change of Heart, Brain Control, as well as Snatch Steal as one card because they all do similar things. In fact, there were another trio of cards that were commonly used between 2006 to 2010 that were really powerful that no one plays anymore. And those trio of cards would be Allure of Darkness, Destiny Draw, and Trade-In. All three of these cards have very similar effects, with Trade-In and Destiny Draw requiring you to discard a particular card from your hand to draw 2 cards, and Allure of Darkness not necessarily needing a card initially, but if you don't banish a dark monster, you're going to lose your entire hand. Allure of Darkness was just previously tried out in one of the more powerful decks named Malice, but as of current, most competitive Yu-Gi-Oh lists don't even bother with the card. You would wonder why. Well, you see, the problem with these particular cards lies within its effect. When these cards were really popular, drawing cards from your deck was one of the most efficient ways to be able to get the cards that you need. But unfortunately, in modern day Yu-Gi-Oh, you can just get the card that you need, with tons of cards allowing you to be able to search other cards, which allows you to eventually get other cards from your deck. There's no need to get 2 random cards and having to give up a card in order to increase those chances. There's also to note in Destiny Draw and Trade-In situation, if these spell cards are stopped, you can be looking at a very unreasonable situation. Losing a card from your hand as well as having that card stopped, meaning essentially you lost 2 cards in your hand and got nothing in return. And speaking of draw cards, it's not like every single draw card is made the same. While Trade-In, Allure, and Destiny Draw don't see any play, cards like Triple Tactics Talent and Pot of Extravagance are still seen as really powerful Yu-Gi-Oh cards. Even on the ban list, Pot of Greed still resides there. Drawing cards for free will typically always be valued, unless we're talking about cards like Pot of Avarest. Pot of Avarest is really interesting because its greatest strength eventually became its downfall. Being able to shuffle 5 monsters from your graveyard back into your deck to get 2 additional cards was crazy good in the eras of Edison and Tengu Plan. During this time, Pot of Avarest was so good it eventually was banned, but then was limited and then eventually unlimited in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! It is a card that no one plays. And the crazy thing, it goes back to Pot of Avarest's effect. Shuffling 5 monsters from your graveyard back into your deck to draw 2 cards is nice, until you realize that a lot of the times you want those monsters into your graveyard. Also, while drawing 2 cards could be considered nice, a lot of times players will go for a more consistent approach. I remember back in the days, oftentimes on the show, people would use spell cards to be able to boost their monsters. It was a fairly viable strategy in old school Yu-Gi-Oh! And cards like Mage Power as well as United We Stand were at the pinnacle. Mage Power giving your monster 2500 attack is a huge ordeal, especially considering that a lot of times you could just set spells and trap cards face down to boost your monster. And United We Stand was another crazy blowout Yu-Gi-Oh card because it allowed you to be able to empower a monster by 800 points instead of 5, but required monsters. Not necessarily hard to do when you have cards like Scapegoat in Yu-Gi-Oh! Now, it's pretty easy to see why these cards fell out of favor. It's simply because attack points normally doesn't matter. Oftentimes in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! You're not going to use your monster to attack over your opponent's monster. That's very old school. And to be honest, that concept has been a thing for a very long time in Yu-Gi-Oh! But now that I'm speaking about it, it also brings us to our very next card in Scapegoat. This was a crazy powerful Yu-Gi-Oh! Card that not only defined its own format, it was also a pivotal card in the Link era format to supply yourself with a ton of monsters. Now, some of you guys may have turned your face up to Link monsters, and I actually made a video on why everyone hates Link monsters, so go ahead and check that video out. But the reason why Scapegoat was so powerful is that it did provide 4 bodies to your side of the field. Whether it was 4 Scapegoats plus a monster with United We Stand, or using them to make Link spiders to climb into powerful monsters like Boral Sword Dragon. The reason why Scapegoat isn't as powerful as it once was is because it's an incredibly slow Yu-Gi-Oh card. when you're activating Scapegoat, you can't summon more monsters for the duration of the turn. That was often bypassed because it was a quick play spell card and you could use it on your opponent's turn, then use the tokens for later. But nowadays in modern Yu-Gi-Oh, that's just not gonna cut it. On top of that, there are a ton of ways to be able to supply yourself with enough bodies to be able to summon almost any Link monster in the game. One thing that I've noticed about spell cards is that a lot of their utility has been taken away. Oftentimes there's a monster that can be special summoned from the extra deck to be able to deal with other monsters and spell and trap cards. And that's where it brings us to cards like Mystical Space Typhoon and Twin Twisters. Mystical Space Typhoon is a card that needs to be studied. During its time, it was played in 100% of decks, and there were no exceptions. I wouldn't even be surprised if Mystical Space Typhoon is still the most played spell card in Yu-Gi-Oh! Of all time. It was a card that was played in 2002 when Magic Ruler was released and stopped being played roughly around 2015. That's roughly 13 years of a spell card being played in every single Yu-Gi-Oh! Deck imaginable. You can't really get to that type of consistency. It had Yu-Gi-Oh! Players in the chokehold. There's even YouTube channels named after Mystical Space Typhoon and memes surrounding the card. Does MST negate? Mystical Space Typhoon and its cousin Twin Twisters were eventually kicked out of the metagame simply because there are cards that do the role better. Cosmic Cyclone allows you to be able to get rid of a spell or trap card, but can banish the card. And then there are extra deck monsters like Tornado Dragon and Nightmare Phoenix that fulfill Mystical Space Typhoon's role. This could also be said for the spell cards that got rid of monsters. I know it's really old school when I say cards like Fissure, Smashing Ground, and Torrential Tribute were peak Yu-Gi-Oh! At the time, but it was one of the only ways to be able to get rid of your opponent's monster outside of battling them. Unfortunately, when it comes to monster destruction, we have no shortage of those on Yu-Gi-Oh! Cards in general. But even if we were to remove every single one that is currently being played in Yu-Gi-Oh! Right now, cards like Nightmare Cerberus serves as a reminder that those spell cards will probably never be played again. Sometimes when powerful cards get removed from the metagame, it could be considered a good thing, but it can also show how other cards can be significantly affected. One of my favorite cards is Forbidden Lance. Now, I don't want you guys to run around thinking that Forbidden Lance got axed out because of Fissure and Smashing Ground. I still think that Forbidden Lance is a very powerful spell card. There just aren't enough spell or trap cards in the game that affect the monster to make this card viable. During its time when Forbidden Lance was king, cards like Mirror Force, Dimensional Prison, and Torrential Tribute were the rage. Even cards like Bottomless Trap Hole were significantly powerful. I just so happen to have made a video on the 10 most powerful trap cards that are now considered useless, so be sure to check out that video if you want to hear about those trap cards and why they're not as powerful. But the reason why Forbidden Lance isn't as powerful is because those cards aren't powerful. Until those cards become good again, Lance will be pretty dormant. And that brings us to our last spell card. Now, I can talk about a ton of really good spell cards. I can do this forever. And if you guys want to see more videos like this, let me know down below in the comment section what are some other powerful spell cards that get left to the wayside. Also, if you have any other ideas for another particular top 10, I'm all ears. I love doing these videos, and sometimes I just need you guys to help your boy out. The last card is easily Book of Moon. Book of Moon has such an interesting story because it still is one of the most powerful spell cards in the game. It can be used offensively to be able to dodge cards like Infinite Impermanence and Effect Favor, but it also can be used defensively to switch your opponent's monster face down. Previously, before, that meant that your opponent couldn't attack with their monsters. Nowadays, in current Yu-Gi-Oh, it means that your opponent can't use it for an extra deck summon most of the time. The unfortunate thing about Book of Moon is that right now, it's completely overshadowed by its little brother, Book of Eclipse. Book of Eclipse has those same benefits, except it can flip all of your opponent's monsters face down. And if you remember what I said about your opponent drawing, giving them cards in their hand at the end of the turn is even worse than getting cards in the hand with cards like Allure of Darkness and Destiny Draw. Spell cards still serve as a cornerstone and one of the most important pieces in Yu-Gi-Oh! But unfortunately, these are some of the spell cards that are left to the wayside. Overall though, I can't wait to make another one of these videos, so again, let me know down below in the comment section what should you think I do next, and then when I make those videos, make sure you click on one of these so I can catch you on the next one.